Hi, everybody. Welcome back to The Human Challenge, where we explore all of the human challenges in today's world, the challenges of being human, and how we can challenge ourselves to be more human for the greater good. I'm your host, Vanessa Ferlano, and today we are speaking to Kylie Hwang, Assistant Professor of Management and Organizations at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. Her research examines how businesses can alleviate the systemic inequality that marginalized populations face in the labor market and in society at large. As she particularly focuses on entrepreneurship as a pathway for marginalized groups to overcome labor market discrimination and achieve economic and social mobility. Welcome to the show, Kylie.
Thank you. I'm honored to be on your podcast, Vanessa. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I know you just recently published your paper in the American Journal of Sociology, Entrepreneurship as a Response to Labor Market Discrimination for Formerly Incarcerated People. I had the chance to read through this maybe like 50-page article as someone who's like not statistically inclined. And it was actually a phenomenal read. It was so fascinating, and I know you're going to dig into it. But for me, the way that you approached this, like all the considerations you made, and then how you approached it was just like mind blown. I was I thought it was fascinating, super, super interesting. And so please tell us a little bit more about the study that you did and how you did it and what you were aiming to achieve with it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for reading through the very long paper. It means a lot to me. So basically, my research examines, as you mentioned, entrepreneurship as a response or a kind of way to overcome labor market discrimination for formerly incarcerated people in the United States. So before I go kind of deeper into the project, I'll just give you a little bit of a backdrop of the criminal justice system in the U.S. So while the U.S. has around 2 million people behind bars as of now, so it has the highest incarceration rate in the whole world. This means that we have around 600,000 people re-entering every year back from prisons or jails. So we have a lot of people coming back, but actually successful reentry or reintegration is the exception in the United States, where we have around 2/3 of these formerly incarcerated individuals actually rearrested or recidivating, going back to prisons or jails within around 3 years of reentry into the society. So this is a huge problem for the U.S. And while there are perhaps many factors that lead to this high recidivism rate among the people who come out of prisons and jails, discrimination in the labor market or from employers has been kind of cited as the dominant reason of why we see such bad re-entry outcomes for formerly incarcerated people, because formerly incarcerated people are almost as half or almost a third as likely to find jobs in traditional employment because many times of the discrimination or biases that they face from employers. So kind of a stylized fact that we've been thinking about is that formerly incarcerated people come out from prisons and jails, they're faced with unemployment or underemployment because of discrimination, and therefore that leads to a higher recidivism rate in the US. So the dominant narrative has been that without kind of tackling the labor market discrimination from employers, the US will always be facing kind of bad reentry outcomes for formerly incarcerated people. We try to broaden the narrative and think about entrepreneurship and kind of highlight and bring attention to entrepreneurship as a potential pathway or an alternative pathway that formerly incarcerated people can take. So in the paper, we basically find three main things. So firstly, formerly incarcerated people actually do engage in entrepreneurship a lot more than we would actually intuitively think about. Because many times when we think about entrepreneurship, we're thinking about kind of Silicon Valley type entrepreneurs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in our data and in kind of the society, a lot of formerly incarcerated people go into more so like small businesses or mom and pop shops, like tailor shops, bakeries, catering services, things like that. In the face of the fact that it's very difficult for them to find other employment in traditional labor markets. So we try to look at different regions and try to compare regions with a lot of labor market discrimination against people with criminal records and less discrimination against people with criminal records. And we find that in regions that have more labor market discrimination, formerly incarcerated people are more likely to go into entrepreneurship because it's even harder for them to find work. And then the second part, we start looking at the outcomes of then what happens when formerly incarcerated people actually engage in entrepreneurship. The first outcome we look at is their income. And we find that actually formerly incarcerated people have higher income when they become entrepreneurs compared to what they would have earned if they were in employment or traditional employment. So this was really interesting for us because we would normally think that employment provides kind of the best income or best wage outcomes for people. But for formerly incarcerated people, because they're faced with really a lack of employment opportunities, when they actually even do find employment, they're many times kind of delegated to kind of bad jobs or kind of jobs that have dead ends that don't really have a lot of mobility in terms of economic or social mobility. So entrepreneurship actually provides them with higher wages or higher income than what they would have gotten in traditional employment. And the third outcome, a third thing that we find is another outcome that we look at, which is recidivism, which is really an important outcome of whether or not formerly incarcerated people go back into the criminal justice system, right? So we find that formerly incarcerated people who engage in entrepreneurship are almost as likely to not go back to prisons or jails as people who have steady employment. And sometimes we find even better outcomes for people in entrepreneurship than people in employment. So we find these kind of positive outcomes that entrepreneurship is leading formerly incarcerated people into, kind of making us think about entrepreneurship and rethink entrepreneurship as perhaps an alternative pathway for this population.
And that's really interesting to me. And I think that I work in, I'm an impact investor, systemic investor actually is something I'm gravitating more towards. And how do we invest capital into, I guess, crossovers between systems, and how do we invest it in a way so that we allow the system to self-organize, essentially, right? The flow of capital is pretty unidirectional. And so if we can, deploy capital with different players in different ways, we can allow the system to self-organize. And so for me, I think I remember seeing this announcement that this article was published, and I was like, oh my gosh, I have to read it because, there's lots of discussion around how do we support as investors, how do we support newcomers, how do we support, refugees. But I don't think I've ever really been in a discussion where it's like, how do we support former incarcerated individuals and their entrepreneurial journeys? And so it was very, very interesting to me. I also wondered if you could share a little bit, how you studied this, because honestly, I thought it was fantastic. Like, I mean, I just thought it was amazing as someone who's, not statistically inclined, but like to actually read like how, because these are a lot of considerations that you had to make just to find all these outcomes, right? And obviously I could not understand the math, and I just appreciated the math for its mathematical beauty that it was. I was like, that's lovely, and it looks nice. There's some squiggles. That's great. but maybe being able to tell us a little bit, like, where you got this data from, and then how you basically built out this study.
Absolutely. So we're using the NLSY data set. So it's the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth data set 1997. And it basically is publicly available data set, and it's a national representative state survey that's run by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So it's a government-run kind of survey, and it's a survey that started in 1997. It was annual until, I believe, 2011, and after that, it's become biannual. So it's basically following around 10,000 individuals. To be specific, it's like 8,900 individuals, starting from 1997 all the way up till, and it's still ongoing. So the data that we're looking at in the study stops in 2015, but it's still ongoing. And I think the most recent release was 2021. So basically it's a panel data. So it means that we're following individuals every year, and we're collecting the same kind of variables so that we can see how they've changed over the years in terms of employment, in terms of incarceration, education, and other things, variables that we would need to consider. So basically we use this data set, and we're taking these individuals and we're comparing both individuals with former incarceration histories and without former incarceration histories, and trying to see whether they differ in their likelihood of engaging in entrepreneurship, whether they differ in terms of their outcomes in wages or in recidivism as well. So the sample kind of changes. So we would kind of like hone in and kind of zoom into the people who have formerly incarcerated histories for the recidivism outcomes. But we start off with like the whole population, thinking about what leads to entrepreneurship and whatnot. So I think one of the main considerations that we have to think about kind of statistically or empirically, is that there are a lot of kind of confounding factors that lead to outcomes, right? So, for example, let's take the first question of who becomes an entrepreneur. And what we basically wanted to show that was that people with criminal histories or people who have been incarcerated before are more likely to become entrepreneurs than people who haven't. But it's really difficult to kind of tease that apart and make a causal claim that it's really about the incarceration history, because there are other things that lead people into incarceration, which may also lead people into entrepreneurship, right? So there's been other work, that other great work that's shown that people who have higher risk preference are more likely to go into drug dealing, which leads to incarceration. But then the same kind of higher risk preference can lead people into entrepreneurship, right? So there's these individual kind of level factors, and also other things like poverty can lead people to both. Things like lower education perhaps can lead people to both, and things like that. So it's really difficult to kind of tease apart these individual characteristics that can lead people to both incarceration and entrepreneurship. That was like kind of the main challenge, where it's really difficult to tease that apart. So we do several things here. So the first thing is that we try to compare within individuals. So we're trying to compare after, so before a person gets incarcerated, what are kind of their labor market engagements? And then after they get incarceration history, what are their employment engagements? So basically, if it was really about risk preference, we would expect that this person was probably in entrepreneurship even before they got their incarceration history and afterwards as well. But then we wouldn't be considering that as an effective incarceration. So that's one main thing we try to do. And then the second main thing, which is kind of the bigger meat of the paper, I think, is that we're trying to really focus on whether it's kind of the labor market discrimination from the incarceration that leads people into entrepreneurship, right? So we want to tease that kind of mechanism out. So that's why we try to focus on different regions that have different levels of discrimination for people with criminal records, and try to see whether the entrepreneurship engagement levels differ. So we use ban the box policies to actually get at that. And basically what we're trying to say is that in regions that have banned the box policy, so it's basically a policy that bans employers from asking criminal records when they're hiring new people. So basically in regions that have banned the box, people with former incarceration histories are more likely to find employment easily, because now they don't have to disclose their criminal histories to employers, which would mean that they would be less likely to resort to entrepreneurship because they have lack of employment. So we try to see the differences between regions. And basically we do find that in regions that have banned the box, which means that formerly incarcerated people have more employment opportunities, they're less likely to go into entrepreneurship. And we find this only for Black individuals, so Black formerly incarcerated individuals, which is really kind of in line with a lot of the research that shows that Black formerly incarcerated individuals are the ones who see the greatest discrimination or greatest biases from employers. So I think that's how we try to get at some of the difficulties of teasing apart the mechanisms. And it comes with a lot of caveats as well, right? We still have a lot of things to consider. For example, there's a lot of discussion on what ban the box really means for formerly incarcerated people versus just Black individuals without formerly incarcerated histories. We can get more into that later on, but I think there's still a lot to consider, but still we tried these things so that we can tease apart the different mechanisms that can show perhaps the same effects that we're finding in our research.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I mean, it was very fascinating when I read through the paper, and I was just how the thought that has to go into it to make sure that you're actually connecting these dots the right way. It was really, really fascinating. You mentioned a little bit about, you talked a little bit about Black people. And I know, and I think it was interesting too, something that was in the paper, how it seems to impact Black, formerly incarcerated individuals that are Black or African American. They seem to be, I think that it's harder for them, right, to go back into the system and get a job. And so I think they're more likely to go into entrepreneurship, I think, if I remember correctly.
Exactly. So when we talk about the criminal justice system in the United States, it's really hard to kind of take that apart with the intersection with race, right? So Black or Hispanic, formerly Black or Hispanic individuals are a lot more likely to first enter into the criminal justice system. So they're a lot more likely to get a conviction. They're more likely to be incarcerated, and the rates are much, much higher. So that's the first kind of intersection. But then even after coming out of the criminal justice system, there's been a lot of work, for example, by Diva Pager, who shows that Black or Hispanic individuals with criminal records are a lot less likely to find employment compared to white counterparts who also have the same criminal record. So you see kind of like a double kind of negative where they are already more likely to go into the criminal justice system, but even when they come out, they're even also more likely to gain penalties. So we see a lot of intersection with these, the race problem in the criminal justice system in the United States. So we were actually not very surprised, I guess, in the finding that Black formerly incarcerated individuals were the ones who were more likely to go into entrepreneurship because of kind of labor market discrimination or employer discrimination in the United States. And then they were also the ones who were many times benefiting the most from the entrepreneurship that they're going into. And it's really because that they're kind of counterfactual. So what would these Black formerly incarcerated people have done if they weren't going into entrepreneurship? Is probably they're the ones who are more likely to be in unemployment or really underemployed in jobs that aren't really paying them well or not really providing the stability that someone needs to actually stay out of prison, right? So I think we found these intersections with race where it was a lot of the benefits that we were seeing from entrepreneurship or kind of even the route of entrepreneurship as an alternative pathway was really piling on to the minority race of the United States, where they were really the ones reaping the benefits.
Right. And now for someone like myself, I'm an impact investor. I work in impact investing. And so I think to myself, how do we help? How can
Mhm.
I support formerly incarcerated individuals in their entrepreneurial journeys, in starting their businesses? And I think that's a big question, but I think there are a few things that, when I think of this, I'm like, okay, how would I do this? I'd want to
Mhm.
know, what types of ventures or industries or occupations or companies are formerly incarcerated individuals starting? What are some of the challenges? I think that's beyond the scope of your paper, but maybe, I don't know, maybe you have some insight into that. What are those challenges that they face when they are starting their companies? And then from there, how do we help as investors or as ecosystem players? How do we support their journey?
Absolutely. I think that's a great question. So I think my research kind of points to entrepreneurship as an alternative pathway, but I think we, like my co-author and I, are always kind of careful and not trying to romanticize entrepreneurship or try to say that entrepreneurship is the panacea for all the problems that exist in the US criminal justice system, because it really isn't, right? As you
Yeah.
mentioned, entrepreneurship comes with its own challenges, and these challenges are likely amplified for formerly incarcerated people because the barriers that they face in employment, housing, all the other realms of society are likely to spill over into entrepreneurship as well. So you're absolutely right that formerly incarcerated people, when they're trying to go into entrepreneurship, face a lot of challenges as well. And I think mainly they're twofold. And I think these two challenges can kind of lead to neatly into kind of then what can we do to help as impact investors or as the ecosystem or as governments perhaps as well. So the main two challenges, I think, first is financial, and then the second is kind of human capital or resources. So the first main challenge that formerly incarcerated people face in terms of starting a new business or going into entrepreneurship is that they lack access to financial resources. And this can come from two things. One is that a lot of these formerly incarcerated individuals are coming from poverty or coming from families that don't have a lot of wealth. So basically, we already know that a lot of entrepreneurs kind of start with friends and family capital as well, but these individuals are the ones who really lack that resource. So that comes first. And the second is that basically a lot of the biases or discrimination that formerly incarcerated people face in other realms of the society do exist in the financial part as well,
Hmm.
right? a lot of banks, governments are less likely to kind of provide loans to formerly incarcerated people because of the same biases that we have in terms of employment, in terms of other things as well. So there's been some recent research, and also I'm working on some recent research as well, that shows that formerly incarcerated people, or broadly people with criminal records, are less likely to be able to receive grants, government loans, bank loans, and things like that. So we see a huge barrier, and that will likely lead formerly incarcerated people to either not be able to start businesses, or start businesses that require very little startup capital, which we do find, or they would be less likely to actually be able to sustain the businesses that they've started, right? Because they don't have a lot of capital to keep it going. So I think that's one of the main challenges that individuals with this background face. And for example, the Small Business Administration had kind of a restriction on people with convictions from getting loans from the government. And now they are kind of discussing about, and they've been trying to relax that rule. So things like that have been kind of helping, but we're a bit more positive about this to keep going, and there's more kind of movement here. So I think in this kind of realm, perhaps for impact investing, or for other people in the ecosystem of entrepreneurship, perhaps really thinking about looking at the business rather than the criminal record of the founder is really important. Where I think a lot of people with criminal records have kind of creative businesses that are very different from what people without the same background bring to the table. But many times it's that criminal history of the individual that's really stopping these businesses from seeing the light of day, right? So I think that might be one thing that we can think about. And I think the second kind of challenge that a lot of formerly incarcerated people face is really the human capital or social capital aspect. Mostly human capital, I think, in that like many times they spend a lot of times in like prison or in jails. They kind of lose touch with what's the highest, like the most recent technology or the recent ideas. Many times they don't have a lot of knowledge on like basic things like bookkeeping, or like how to incorporate a firm, things like that, right? So I think they just lack a lot of education in that area. And it's really because not only because they've been incarcerated for so long, or how many years they were in, but many times a lot of the training or education is really focused really only on employment, which makes sense, but not a lot of entrepreneurship training is provided. So I think that's one other thing that leads a lot of formerly incarcerated people to like start businesses that are a little bit more small, a little bit more mom and pop shop, less kind of technology integrated and things like that. So I think one kind of other thing that could happen is where the entrepreneurial ecosystem provides more training, more accelerators, perhaps targeted at this population. The government can think about providing in-prison training for individuals who are interested in entrepreneurship, right? So I think these are some things that can be highlighted to make entrepreneurship a bit more of a viable option and not a dead end where we're pushing these people into even more challenging routes. So I think those two are kind of the main like entrepreneurial implications that we can have for the ecosystem.
Yeah, that's one of the first things that came up for me is, like you said, like accelerators, incubators that support formerly incarcerated individuals. I think those are extremely insightful, and I do hope that other audience members that are also impact investors will really sit with some of that and see how we can support. We got the last few minutes here, but I'm extremely curious. Why are you interested in this work? You know, how did you get here, and why was this your calling? Why was studying this your calling?
That's also a great question. So I actually worked at a criminal background check company before I started my doctoral studies. And that was actually where I first really got to get a good look at what the US criminal justice system looks like, right? I had known that we have a lot of incarceration. There's a lot of problems related to race in the criminal justice system, but that was the first time I actually got to really take a deep look into how, in other words, messed up kind of the system was, right? There was this huge vicious cycle that was going on where we have huge incarceration rates. A lot of people come out. We don't actually provide a lot of reintegration strategies. And then we see the bulk of them actually going back to the criminal justice system, and that just keeps going on, raising crime rates and raising biases, because the fact that a lot of them go back to prison is really kind of the reason why a lot of people don't want to hire them, don't want to give them bank loans and things like that, right? So I was really kind of interested in that vicious cycle that happened. And I was trying to think of like creative solutions of then like how can we actually tackle this vicious cycle, which seems for the past decades has been really, really difficult. And I think a lot of the focus has been on employment. And I think employment is, I still believe that it's the number one solution that we still have to think about. But then I got to talk to a lot of formerly individuals, and they were actually already going into entrepreneurship a lot as a pathway because employment was like such a closed door for them. A lot of them would tell me like they had 50 different interviews, all the doors were closed, and they were kind of as a last resort, I might as well just start things on my own, right? So that really got me to thinking about entrepreneurship. I had already been starting doing other entrepreneurship work on other populations, very different. I was looking at hedge fund managers, which can be like the very different, most different population. But that got me interested in thinking about, okay, can entrepreneurship, it already seems to be a pathway that people are going into. How can we kind of think about it more as a potential solution? How can we make it even a better solution, so that employment is not the only viable route and there's another pathway that we can think about? So I think that was kind of that was the story of how I actually got into this. And my co-author was also very much interested in the criminal justice system. And we got talking to a lot of the people who were actually in the criminal justice system. And we started thinking about entrepreneurship as a potential solution.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much, Kylie, for being on the show. Thank you for all your hard work. How can we keep in touch with you? How can we continue to follow you? And what else might be coming up for you in this space?
First of all, I'm very grateful to be on the show. And I'm glad that I can actually reach people outside of like just the academic circle to with my work. I have some other work that's so most of my work focuses on this population and specifically on entrepreneurship. So I hinted at another work where I'm really trying to look at the challenges of entrepreneurship. So I think that's an effort that I've been making just to make sure that I actually am rightly analyzing entrepreneurship as a pathway without romanticizing it too much and thinking about what are the impacts of barriers that we already see. So I have some work on that. I have another work that's really looking at, which I think might be really interesting for impact investors, perhaps, but really thinking about like what are the businesses that
Mhm.
individuals are actually founding, and what do we see from them? What are some outs like spillover benefits that we see? Because I have some kind of preliminary thoughts that and kind of evidence that a lot of the businesses that formerly incarcerated people found are more likely to kind of be socially driven, or they're kind of catering community that they've been from. And many times these communities are the communities that are marginalized from a lot of the major kind of mainstream businesses, right? So I think I'm trying to look into that as well and trying to also think about like, are they hiring more people with criminal records, or are they hiring more minorities? So these are some of the questions that I'm asking. So I'd love to keep in touch, and I'd love for people to kind of keep their eyes open on new research in this field so that we can all kind of work for providing better second chances for this population.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kylie. Thank you so much for being on the show, and I will definitely be in touch.
Thank you so much.